I'm Michael Hazel. I'm a native Dallasite, and I've spent the past 40 years of my career researching and writing about Dallas and this region. And I'm here today visiting with Susanne Starling, another distinguished Dallas historian, retired faculty member at Eastfield College, and a biographer of Warren Angus Ferris. Well, Susanne, what inspired you to write Land is the Cry, the biography of Ferris?
Well, in 1981, I was teaching at Eastfield College, and we were doing some local history and some Dallas history. And there was a young man sitting in the back of the room, never said very much, very quiet fellow. One day he raised his hand and he said, "Miss Starling, my ancestor surveyed Dallas County." And I said, "Well, he did." And I said, "What was his name?" He said, "Warren Angus Ferris." I said, "Well, I never heard of him." He said, "Well, he did, and I've got the papers to prove it." So about 2 weeks later, the same young fellow came in with a manila folder and sort of tossed it on my desk, and the students were taking a test. So while they were taking the test, I looked into the folder. And it was material collected by his grandmother about Ferris. In the manila folder, I found a copy of the oldest letter I had ever seen from Dallas County. It was written from a cold surveyor's camp in the bottomlands of the East Fork of the Trinity. And it was a love letter to Ferris's wife, Melinda. Well, I was hooked. And so I said to the young man, I said, "Do you mind if I keep this material for a little while and look at it more carefully?" And he said, "Yeah, you can keep it."
Land is the Cry is not only a very well-written and fascinating story, but it's meticulously researched and documented. Where did you find the original sources for the book?
Well, I started with this one or two letters that the young man brought to me, and then I visited with his parents. And they loaned me this book, Life in the Rocky Mountains, a diary of wandering on the sources of the Missouri, Columbia, and Colorado rivers. So in his teenage and in his 20s, Warren Ferris worked for John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company. And he kept a diary, and he also drew a map of the fur country, which I included in the back of my book, Land is the Cry. And it is a hand-drawn map that is drawn from memory of the Yellowstone country. He describes the mountains, the valleys, the places where they had their rendezvous, the fur trappers had their rendezvous, and it revealed, his book and his map revealed the wonders of the Yellowstone country. So after Warren Ferris returned from the mountains, he wrote his biography into a manuscript. And so from this book, I realized that there were more letters. They were in Provo, Utah. The Mormons had them. The Mormons are very good about keeping old materials, family histories, and things of that sort. So I spent a week out in Provo going through the letters and photocopying them.
Well, of course, Ferris spent the last decades of his life living in Dallas County as a farmer, and members of his family and he and his wife were buried in what we today refer to as the Ferris Cemetery. How did you get recognition for that cemetery in the Forest Hills neighborhood? And was additional research done relating to that cemetery?
Yes, the Warren Ferris Cemetery has had a tragic history of neglect and vandalism. And the development of the Forest Hills addition began in the 1920s, and a road was bulldozed through the cemetery. So there was just a remnant of the cemetery left by the 1980s. And Francis James and the Dallas County Historical Commission became interested in saving what was left. I would say about a half acre maybe out of the 4 acres that it originally was. And so in 1985, Francis and the Historic Commission, and I helped with that, we got a historic marker, a Texas historic marker for the cemetery. And then in 2016, recently, the cemetery has been declared a Texas historic cemetery. The Ferris Cemetery dates back to 1847, and the first burial there was that of Ferris's young son, a child, who died and was buried there. And the last burial that we know of was in 1901, and that was of a black preacher, a man named Reverend Taylor, who owned property, apparently, in the area where the Arboretum now is located. So the organization Black History Remembered, led by Dr. George Keaton and his research assistant, Shanique Cummings, are also doing research on the people who are buried in the Ferris Cemetery. We have now about 35 names of people buried there, and probably there were as many as 130. It was more than just the Ferris Cemetery. It was a community cemetery, and members of other neighboring farm families like the Chenaults, the Sages, the Herndons, several other families are buried in that cemetery.
Well, what have been some of the highlights of your interviews with these descendants of people buried in the cemetery?
We are writing little short profiles. I'm writing, and they are helping me also. Some of them are good writers and have provided material. We're writing little short profiles of the descendants, along with some wonderful old family photographs, and posting those on the website of the organization Friends of the Warren Ferris Cemetery.
I understand that among the plans for the remaining cemetery property is to create a wildlife way station there. What do you think Warren Ferris himself would think about that?
Well, I think he would have approved. Warren Ferris was a great lover of nature, especially the Blackland Prairie. In 1851, he wrote to his family that he had brought into cultivation 85 acres. Like most farmers on the North Texas prairie, Ferris planted corn. Corn was the staple. They used it for everything. And he also planted wheat, which was a natural on the tall grass prairie. In letters written in 1853 and 1855, Ferris described the growing prosperity of Dallas County. Family grist mills gave way to commercial flour mills that were steam-powered, and that really became the first industry of Dallas. He wrote, "The town of Dallas is becoming quite a little place. We can get nearly everything we want here except rare books. The roads and bridges began to improve. There was a bridge across White Rock Creek, and farmers on the surrounding Blackland Prairie wagoned into Dallas on trade days to sell their produce and buy needed goods. But cotton was the crop that all of these Blackland Prairie farmers yearned to plant. Ferris experimented with growing cotton, and he found the quality good. But Ferris admired the beauty of cotton as much as he did its financial value. And he wrote, 'There are few plants that can vie with cotton in beauty. The deep green foliage contrasting with the red and yellow blossoms and snowy whiteness of the opening cotton present a scene of surpassing beauty.' The closest river port or railroad was over 200 miles away from Dallas. But Warren Ferris lived to see the coming of the railroad. In 1872, the Houston and Texas Central, following what is today Central Expressway, came to Dallas. And the next year, the year that Ferris died, the Texas and Pacific Railroad, running east and west, crossed the other railroad at what is now, what was the old East Dallas Union Station. So Dallas became a transportation hub with 5 railroads. And cotton began to pile up in the warehouses in Dallas. Thousands of cotton wagons caused traffic jams on Lower Elm Street. So a financial and trade center at the crossroads of roads and railroads, Dallas grew up to become a metropolis on the prairie. Based on the hard work of pioneer farmers like Warren Ferris, who first broke the deep black prairie soil. So Ferris loved the Texas prairie, and I think he would approve of a nature center, you might say, in what is now an urban location.
Well, I think that the work that you and the other members of the Friends of Ferris Cemetery are doing is really admirable. Thank you. And I've enjoyed our conversation very much.
Thanks. You must come and see the cemetery.